Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into ancient Rome today,
Right.
but with a twist.
A twist.
Yeah, we're going beyond the typical Romans versus barbarians story,
Right, right.
We're using excerpts from J.H.C. Williams' Beyond the Rubicon
Yeah, okay.
and Tom Holland's Rubicon
Interesting.
to get a more nuanced view
Well,
of how Romans and Gauls interacted.
yeah.
It's a lot more complicated than just fighting all the time, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't just armies clashing, it was perceptions, too.
Yeah.
How the Romans saw the Gauls and how those views changed over time, that tells us so much about Roman anxieties. And really about their ambitions, too.
Yeah, it's like it's like looking in one of those fun house mirrors.
Mm-hmm.
The image is distorted,
Yeah,
but it shows you something about the person holding the mirror, too.
that's a great analogy.
And I think to start, we've got to talk about the sack of Rome in 390 BC.
Yeah.
Tom Holland really captures the chaos of that event,
Yeah.
but he also shows how it became this foundational myth for the Romans.
Exactly. Like, Roman writers, like Livy, they turn it into a story of Roman resilience, with the capital miraculously surviving.
Oh, so that's where that comes from.
Yeah. But if you look at accounts from the Greeks,
Okay.
like Polybius, you get a different perspective.
Really?
Yeah, they acknowledge that the Gauls were really skilled in warfare, and they even kind of question whether Rome was truly invincible,
Like Rome needed that heroic story
Mm,
to hide a deeper fear.
right. Makes you think.
It does. So do you think this fear of the barbarian,
Yeah.
did it become a self-fulfilling prophecy? Did it actually push Rome to expand more and more, like they were constantly trying to get ahead of the next attack?
That's a really key point. Look at the Roman conquest of Cisalpine Gaul.
Okay.
Williams, he traces how Rome took over this territory, building roads like the Via Aemilia.
Oh, right, the famous Roman roads?
Yep. And they established
All part of this, buffer zone?
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't just about land. It was about controlling how people saw them, projecting power.
So they were deterring future threats.
Right. And it worked, mostly.
So Roman roads weren't just for travel, they were like psychological warfare.
Uh-huh. Yeah, you could say that.
But Williams also talks about the Monte Bibeli archaeological site.
Oh, right.
And it kind of messes with this whole us versus them story.
How so?
Well, there are signs of cultural exchange, maybe even intermarriage. So it wasn't all hostile.
That's where things get really interesting, because we start to see how Roman views of the Gauls actually evolved. At first, they're the barbarians, untrustworthy mercenaries. But later, even Roman authors like Livy, they try to give the Gauls in Italy a more civilized origin story.
Wait, so are you saying they were rewriting history
Possibly.
to fit their own agenda, like a PR campaign to make Gauls seem less threatening as they were becoming part of Rome?
Yeah, it's definitely a possibility. And this change in the story had real political impacts, especially for the Gauls living south of the Alps, the Transpodanes.
Right.
They really wanted Roman citizenship,
Mhm.
and they tried to separate themselves from those negative stereotypes about Gauls from across the Alps.
So there was tension, like good Gaul versus bad Gaul.
Exactly.
But I'm also thinking about the social and economic pressures going on. Rome wasn't just expanding for land, it was for wealth and power too, right? Tom Holland really brings that to life when he talks about Roman imperialism and how it affected Roman society.
Yes, and we see this paradox emerge. Rome, afraid of the other, becomes incredibly powerful, but that power comes from conquest and exploitation, which leads to corruption and unrest within Roman society. Like, think about Posidonius and his critique of mass slavery. It was this dark side to Roman prosperity. Or, the extravagant lifestyle of someone like Lucullus, showing how disconnected the elites were from the common people.
So it's like a warning, right? The things that made Rome strong also led to its problems.
Yeah, exactly. And as we get into the late Republic, this tension gets even worse. We see the rise of figures like Marius, Sulla, Pompey, Caesar men who used the anxieties and divisions in Roman society to benefit themselves.
Okay, but hold on. Didn't Romans also use Gauls as mercenaries?
They did.
It seems hypocritical to call them unreliable, but then use them for military support. How does that fit with this whole barbarian unreliability thing?
It's a great point. And honestly, it shows the hypocrisy in a lot of imperial thinking, right? The Romans called Gauls unreliable, but still used them when it was convenient. By keeping that stereotype alive, they could justify their own power and also fuel those fears they used for political gain. It's pretty clever in a cynical way.
It is. So these individual ambitions, they're playing out against this backdrop of tension with the Gauls.
Yes.
It's like Rome's own internal problems made them even more vulnerable, even to threats that might not have even been real.
And that vulnerability, that feeling of being under attack from both inside and outside, that's ultimately what contributed to the Republic's downfall.
Oh.
Yeah. And from that chaos, that collapse, the Roman Empire emerges, right? Tom Holland really paints a vivid picture of this transformation. Like the Campus Martius, it goes from a military training ground to this grand stage for, all this monumental architecture.
So they were trying to build a new image for this new era, literally building over their past.
Right. And Augustus's mausoleum, inspired by Alexander the Great's tomb, that's a pretty clear message connecting himself to this legacy of conquest and empire.
Not subtle at all.
No, not at all. It's a calculated move to show power and legitimacy. But Holland points out the tension here, right? Augustus is trying to bring back traditional Roman values.
Okay.
But at the same time, he's consolidating power, taking away political freedom. It's a restored republic that's actually an empire,
So is that it then? Is that the victory of fear, this barbarian threat, real or imagined?
Yeah.
It brings down the very system it was meant to protect.
It's a question historians are still debating, but let's rewind a bit. Back to that sack of Rome in 390 BC, Williams, he goes deep into how the story of that event has been told and retold over time.
Yeah, like a game of historical telephone.
Exactly. Each retelling adds a new spin. But Williams finds this really interesting detail in Suetonius's biography of Tiberius.
Oh, what's that?
Well, it contradicts the traditional story of Camillus, the Roman hero, rescuing Rome from the Gauls.
They vaguely remember that story from school.
Right. So Suetonius tells this story about Drusus, a Roman general who supposedly kills a Gallic chieftain named Drusus,
Okay.
takes his name, and even gets back the gold that was paid as ransom.
Yep.
It directly challenges that whole Camillus myth, suggesting that, there were different versions of the story going around in Rome.
It's not just about history then, it's about who gets to control the narrative. These stories, they shape Roman memory,
They do.
creating heroes and villains,
Absolutely.
and shaping how future generations saw the Gauls, that threat from them.
Precisely. And it wasn't just limited to the sack of Rome. Williams gives another example. The conflicting accounts of how the Carytans, and a neighboring people, they lost their full Roman citizenship.
What happened there?
So one version says they were rebels, punished for being disloyal,
Okay.
but another version makes them heroes, rewarded with citizenship for protecting Roman sacred objects during the sack.
So, depending on which story you believe, they're either traitors or saviors. History really is written by the victors.
It often is, and those narratives, they have real consequences.
They do. This brings us back to how Romans viewed the Gauls. We talked about that barbarian stereotype.
Yeah.
But Williams looks at how this image was specifically shaped and sometimes even challenged over time.
Yeah.
Like the traditional story of how Gauls got to northern Italy, it paints them as like this plundering horde.
Classic barbarian image.
Chaotic, violent, the opposite of Roman order.
Exactly. But Williams points out that later Roman authors, like Trogus and Livy, they try to create a more civilized origin story for the Gauls. They link their arrival to the founding of Massilia, a Greek colony.
So they're making them seem more like part of the civilized world.
Right, like a PR campaign to make them more acceptable within the Roman state.
It makes sense, especially with those trans-Bedane communities wanting full Roman citizenship.
It does. They could use this new origin story to argue for their place in the Roman world.
This idea of civilization, it becomes a tool
It does.
to decide who's in and who's out.
Yeah. Makes you wonder, though, did the Romans ever really see Gauls as equals? Or was it always about power and dominance?
That's a good question.
It's complicated, and I think Williams would say it wasn't just one or the other. Yes, Romans saw themselves as superior, but they also recognized that Gauls were skilled in warfare. They even admired their courage, though maybe in a condescending way.
A kind of like backhanded compliment.
Yeah, maybe. But what's important is that Roman perceptions of Gauls were shaped by their own fears and ambitions. They needed that barbarian threat to justify their expansion and to reinforce their own identity.
It's a cycle then. Fear leads to expansion. Expansion leads to more contact with barbarians, which makes them even more afraid.
Exactly. And this brings us to another key point Williams makes. How Romans gathered information about the world, especially compared to the Greeks.
How were they different?
Williams argues that the Greeks, they had a more abstract interest in geography and ethnography. The Romans, though, they focused on information that was useful for the military or politics.
So the Greeks were philosophers and the Romans were pragmatists.
In a way, yes. They wanted details about foreign customs, enemy tactics, geography, all to help them strategize.
Less philosophy, more like a conquest handbook.
Pretty much. And this information didn't come just from what they saw themselves. They relied on reports from generals, inscriptions from triumphs, even works of art.
Wow. It's like they were creating this huge database of knowledge.
They were. A way to categorize and ultimately control anyone they saw as different. But Williams also points out that their curiosity had limits set by their imperial ambitions.
What do you mean?
He compares Cato the Elder, who was really interested in the Alps and northern Italy, to Alexandrian scholars who were gathering information about all sorts of far-off lands.
Okay.
Cato's curiosity, Williams says, it came from Rome's expanding power. They studied what they wanted to conquer.
So they used knowledge as a tool of empire.
Exactly. And this focus on practical knowledge, it shaped how they saw the Gauls. Remember, the Romans were big on environmental determinism, the idea that climate and geography determined a people's character.
Like nature versus nurture.
Yeah, like that. Polybius, for example, he said that the Gauls were barbaric because of their harsh climate and rough terrain.
So their environment made them warlike.
Right, and it's used to justify Roman dominance. This deterministic view also shaped their military strategy. They studied Gallic tactics, weapons, even their psychology, all to figure out how to beat them.
It's amazing how powerful ideas can be. Even something like environmental determinism can change the course of history.
It can. But Williams points out that the Romans weren't always consistent. They could pick and choose which evidence to use, emphasizing Gallic barbarity when it suited them.
So it's more about creating a narrative that works for Rome.
Exactly. And we see this especially in how they portray Gallic military tactics and weaponry.
Oh yeah, those images of Gauls charging into battle with those huge swords and shields.
Yes. And Polybius, he spends a lot of time describing them with a mix of admiration and kind of looking down on them. He says they're courageous and fierce, but undisciplined and not very sophisticated tactically.
Brave but flawed.
Right. And Williams argues that this portrayal was meant to reinforce the Roman belief that their military was superior.
So it's propaganda.
It is. But Polybius also talks about the practical problems Gallic warriors faced.
Like what?
Well, he says their big swords were often poorly made. They'd bend or break in battle.
Oh no.
Yeah, he even describes how, in the battle against the Romans at Telamon, some Gauls had to hammer their swords straight on the ground.
Wow, imagine that.
It disrupted their whole battle line.
It's almost funny, but also kind of sad.
Yeah, it is. And Williams says this detail shows something important about Roman warfare. They were obsessed with logistics, making sure their soldiers had good equipment and understood their objectives.
Less about individual heroism, more about efficiency.
Exactly. This focus on practicality also shows up in how they analyze Gallic armor. Polybius says a lot of Gauls fought with their chests bare or just wore a thin linen corselet.
That classic barbarian warrior look.
Right. But Polybius, being practical, points out the downsides. He describes how, at the Battle of Cannae, Gallic warriors were killed in huge numbers by Roman javelins because their lack of armor made them so vulnerable.
So bravery doesn't always win.
No, it doesn't. And Williams says this shows the Roman belief in discipline and preparation. They knew battles weren't won just by courage, but by strategy, planning, and reliable equipment.
It's a really interesting look into the Roman mindset.
It is. This mix of practicality and a belief in their own superiority. And this mindset, it affected not only how they dealt with the Gauls, but also the entire course of Roman history. It's this perspective that allows us to understand one of the most impactful aspects of Roman expansion, highlighted by both Williams and Holland, the transformation of the Italian landscape.
It's amazing how those little details, like the type of sword or armor, can tell you so much about a culture. But let's look at the bigger picture now. One of the most impactful things about Roman expansion, as both Williams and Holland point out, was how they changed the Italian landscape.
Absolutely. The Romanization of Italy wasn't just about politics. It was about physically reshaping the land,
Right.
imposing their order on the world. Think about those massive roads they built, like the Via Aemilia and the Via Postumia.
Oh, yeah?
They weren't just for travel. They were symbols of Roman power, connecting Rome to every corner of their territory.
So they were claiming ownership not just through armies, but through infrastructure.
Exactly. And it wasn't just roads. Williams talks about Roman colonies, too, these settlements that were strategically placed to spread Roman culture and administration.
Like mini Romes.
Yes, and they weren't just about housing a growing Roman population.
Right.
They were about controlling key areas, especially newly conquered places like Cisalpine Gaul.
Makes sense.
And they had another purpose, to Romanize the local people, bring them into the Roman system.
So spreading Roman culture and values throughout Italy.
Right. But Williams says this process wasn't the same everywhere. He compares the area south of the Po River, which had lots of colonies, to the Transpadane region, where there weren't as many Roman settlements.
So why the difference?
Williams says it reflects that Roman anxiety about the Gauls. They put a lot of effort into securing the areas closest to Rome.
To protect themselves.
Exactly. A dense network of colonies and roads to guard against Gallic attacks. The Transpadane region, further from Rome and already home to people who wanted Roman citizenship, it wasn't seen as such an immediate threat. And this difference in approach had long-lasting effects. The areas south of the Po, with all those colonies, they became more Romanized.
So the closer to Rome, the more Roman they became.
Right. But the Transpadane region, even though it was politically part of Rome, it kept more of its own culture. It shows how geography and political strategy can shape how cultures develop.
So Romanization wasn't just everyone becoming the same. There were regional differences and even some resistance.
Absolutely. And one really striking example of Rome securing its northern border, as Williams points out, is the founding of Epiridia in 100 BC.
Tell me about that.
This colony, it was established after the Cimbric Wars, those invasions by Germanic tribes that really scared Rome. It was a clear sign that Rome was determined to hold on to its territory.
So like a fortress city.
Yeah, you could say that. Strategically placed to guard against future attacks from beyond the Alps.
So Rome was still really worried about the Gauls and their neighbor.
They were. Williams argues that founding Epiridia, this expansion into new territory, it shows just how deep that Roman anxiety ran.
Fear really drove the Roman Empire, didn't it?
It did. The Romans were great at using their fear of the other to justify expansion, conquest, and even cultural change.
So the Roman story isn't just about victory and glory.
No, it's not.
It's also about fear, pragmatism, and how culture, power, and identity all interact.
Exactly. That's what makes studying this period so fascinating.
It really is. This deep dive has made me think about the Roman-Gallic relationship in a whole new way. It wasn't just about conquest. It was this complex interaction of cultures.
It was. Military conflicts, politics, cultural exchanges, even attempts to understand each other.
And by looking at these sources, we can move beyond the simple stories and appreciate those nuances. See, the history is never black and white.
You're right. And speaking of questions, here's one for you to think about. If this Roman fear of the barbarian was so deeply ingrained in their culture and strategy, how did it affect how they saw themselves? Did it contribute to the Republic's decline, or was it, in a way, what made them successful?
Wow, that's a tough one. I think I need another deep dive to figure that out.
Yeah.
It's amazing how strategic the Romans were, building roads, those colonies, like reshaping the whole landscape to cement their power.
It's impressive.
But what about the Gauls themselves? How did they react to all this? Were they just like passively Romanized, or did they push back?
That's a really important question. And we have to remember, Romanization wasn't a uniform thing. Williams points out that, yeah, some Gal communities adopted aspects of Roman culture, but others resisted, sometimes violently. And that resistance, it took many forms, from outright rebellion to, like, more subtle ways of preserving their culture.
I bet it was a really confusing time for them. Like, on one hand, Roman citizenship was appealing.
Oh, absolutely.
It meant access to trade, infrastructure. But on the other hand, they're being asked to give up their traditions, their language, their whole identity.
Exactly. Williams really digs into this internal conflict. He talks about how some Gallic elites, they cleverly adopted Roman customs and language to get ahead in the new power structure. They might wear togas, speak Latin publicly, even build Roman-style villas.
Oh, wow.
But in private, they'd hold on to their traditional beliefs and practices.
So like living a double life.
Yeah.
Roman on the outside, Gallic on the inside.
Yeah, pretty much. It was a way to navigate Roman rule, benefit from it, without completely losing their own heritage.
That's smart. But I'm guessing this balancing act wasn't always easy. Were there any specific examples of Gallic resistance that really stand out?
There are a few that Williams highlights. He talks about Gallic religion as a form of resistance. The Romans, they were all about state-sponsored cults and emperor worship, right? They often tried to suppress or, absorb local deities.
To control religion, too.
Yeah, but Gallic religious practices, they were so deeply rooted in their identity, they were hard to stamp out.
So even in their faith, the Gauls were pushing back.
They were, and not always peacefully either. Williams mentions several Gallic revolts,
Oh, wow.
often triggered by Roman attempts to, impose taxes or restrict their customs.
Makes sense.
These revolts, they didn't overthrow Roman rule,
Right.
but they show that the Gauls kept fighting for their autonomy, their identity.
It's inspiring, in a way. Even when the odds are stacked against you, people find ways to resist, to hold on to what's important.
I agree, it's powerful. But what about the long-term impact? Did Gallic culture just vanish, or did it leave a mark on Roman society?
It's a good question.
It's one his historians are still debating. On one hand, Romanization was pretty thorough. Latin, Roman law, Roman customs, they became deeply embedded in Gallic society.
Okay.
But on the other hand, parts of Gallic culture survived.
Uh-huh.
They often mixed with Roman traditions, creating something new.
So the kind of cultural fusion, Roman and Gallic influences blending together.
Exactly. And you see this in Gallo-Roman culture, in their art, architecture, religion, even everyday life.
Could you give me an example?
Sure. One of the most striking is the development of Romano-Celtic temples. They took elements of Roman design, but also had distinct Celtic motifs and incorporated Gallic deities alongside Roman gods.
Wow, so they're worshiping together.
It's a really cool example of how these two cultures, even though they were different, could coexist, even complement each other.
That's amazing.
I mean-
So Romanization wasn't just about wiping out cultures.
Yeah.
It was about adaptation and exchange, too.
It was. But how did this play out on a personal level? Did Romans and Gauls ever really see each other as equals?
Yeah, I'm curious about that.
Well, equality in Rome was tied to citizenship and social status.
Right.
Gauls could become Roman citizens, even rise to positions of power, but they still often faced prejudice.
So even as citizens, they were still outsiders.
In many ways, yes. And this tension between being included and excluded, it pops up a lot in Roman history. But there are also examples of genuine friendship and collaboration.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Williams mentions intermarriage among Roman and Gallic elites and evidence of trade and economic partnerships across cultures. These interactions, they often get overlooked, but they show that there was potential for mutual benefit and understanding.
So it wasn't just Rome dominating everything.
No, it's a reminder that even in an empire, human connection can go beyond cultural divides. But I'm thinking back to that Roman fear of the barbarian. Did that ever really go away, even as Gauls became part of Roman society?
It's a good question.
It's a tough one. I think it's complicated. The fear of a Gallic invasion probably lessened once Gaul became a Roman province, but that broader Roman anxiety about barbarians, that stuck around.
So less about a specific enemy, more like a general fear of anyone outside Roman civilization.
Exactly. And that anxiety, as we've talked about, Roman leaders used it to justify expansion, to hold on to their power.
It's a recurring theme.
It is.
Mm-hmm.
This deep dive has really changed how I think about the Roman-Gallic relationship.
Me too. It's so much more complex than just conquest and assimilation.
You're right. It's a mix of cultures, power dynamics, individual experiences, and I think that's one of the most important things we can take away from this.
Yeah.
By digging into these sources, we can move past the simple stories and appreciate the nuances of history, see that it's never as straightforward as it seems.
Absolutely. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
Okay.
But before we go, I want to leave everyone with a final thought. We've talked a lot about how Romans saw the Gauls, but how did the Gauls see themselves in this changing world? What did it mean to be Gallic as Roman society spread all around them? Something to think about.
It is. A great question to ponder. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yes, thank you to everyone listening.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep uncovering those hidden depths of history.